The beam of my headlight cut through the darkness, a lonely island of illumination in a sea of black. I never should have come out here alone. It was supposed to be a quick night ride to clear my head. Work had been stressful, and I needed to blow off some steam. The trails near my house were familiar territory. I'd ridden them 100 times before, but never quite this late, and never completely alone. The initial rush of adrenaline felt good as I pedaled into the woods. The cool night air on my face, the rhythmic crunch of tires on dirt, the gentle whir of the chain. It all melted away the day's tension. For a while, I was in my element, carving through turns and pumping over rollers with practiced ease. But as I ventured deeper into the forest, an uneasy feeling began to creep in. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Shadows danced at the edge of my light, playing tricks on my eyes. More than once, I caught myself flinching at imagined movements in the underbrush. I shook my head, trying to dispel the growing sense of dread. "Get it together," I muttered to myself. "It's just the woods. Nothing's changed." But something had changed. The familiar trail felt alien in the dark. Every root and rock seemed to reach out to grab my tires. The downhills that I usually bombed with abandon now required intense focus. My hands ached from gripping the bars too tightly. I considered turning back, but pride kept me going. I was no rookie. I'd been mountain biking for years. A little darkness wasn't going to scare me off. Besides, I was probably more than halfway through the loop by now. Might as well finish it out. That's when I heard it, a sharp crack of a branch breaking somewhere off to my left. I jerked my head toward the sound, but saw nothing beyond my small circle of light. Probably just a deer, I told myself. The woods were full of them, but the sound came again, closer this time. And it didn't move like a deer. The footfalls were too heavy, too deliberate. A chill ran down my spine as I realized whatever was seemed to be paralleling my path. I picked up my pace, heart pounding. The trail took a sharp right, and I leaned into the turn. As I did, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, a dark shape flitting between the trees. "Hello," I called out, immediately regretting it. My voice sounded small and scared in the vast darkness. There was no response, just the oppressive silence of the forest. I was really moving now, caution thrown to the wind as I blasted down the trail. My light bounced wildly, barely giving me enough time to react to obstacles. I clipped a pedal on a rock and nearly went down, somehow managing to stay upright. The thing in the woods was still there, keeping pace. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush, no longer trying to stay quiet. Whatever it was big. My mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. A bear? A mountain lion? Or something worse? I'd heard stories of homeless camps in these woods, of drug addicts and criminals hiding out from the law. A branch whipped across my face, drawing blood. I barely felt it. All of my focus was on the trail ahead and the unseen threat beside me. My lungs burned as I gulped for air, legs screaming as I pushed myself beyond my limits. Just as I thought I couldn't go any faster, disaster struck. My front wheel washed out in a loose turn, sending me sprawling. I hit the ground hard, tumbling head over heels down a small embankment. Pain exploded through my body as I collided with roots and rocks. I came to a stop in a confused heap, the taste of dirt and blood in my mouth. For a moment, I just lay there dazed. Then the sound of heavy footsteps jolted me back to reality. It was coming. Panic gave me strength as I scrambled to my feet. Where was my bike? I couldn't see it in the darkness. My headlight must have broken in the crash. I had my phone, but no signal out here. I was alone and defenseless. The footsteps were getting closer. I could hear labored breathing now, punctuated by low grunts. My own breath came in ragged gasps as I limped away as fast as I could, one arm cradled against my battered ribs. A twig snapped right behind me. I whirled around, eyes straining to penetrate the inky blackness. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. "I'm warning you, stay back." The response chilled me to my core. A low, rumbling growl emanated from the darkness, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. This was no human. As my eyes adjusted, I could just make out a massive, hulking shape. It was easily 7 feet tall, with glowing eyes that fixed on me with predatory intent. I ran. There was nothing else to do. I crashed through the forest blindly, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. My pursuer was right behind me, moving with unnatural speed and agility through terrain that had me stumbling with every step. My foot caught on an exposed root, and I went down hard. This was it, I thought. This is how I die. I curled into a ball, waiting for razor-sharp claws or teeth to tear into me. But the attack never came. Instead, I heard a confused snuffling, then the sound of my pursuer moving away. After a few moments, all was quiet save for the pounding of my own heart. Slowly, cautiously, I raised my head. My eyes had fully adjusted to the darkness now, and I could make out my surroundings. I was lying at the base of an enormous old oak tree. Its gnarled roots formed a protective cage around me, too tight for my pursuer to reach through. I don't know how long I huddled there, shaking with fear and adrenaline. Eventually, the eastern sky began to lighten. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the trees, I finally felt safe enough to emerge from my shelter. In the growing light, I took stock of my situation. I was battered and bruised, with numerous cuts and scrapes, but nothing seemed to be broken. My phone was miraculously intact, though still without signal. I had no idea where I was, but at least I could use the compass app to navigate. It took hours of walking before I finally found my way back to a trail I recognized. My bike was nowhere to be seen. I must have traveled miles from where I crashed. As I limped back to civilization, my mind churned over the events of the night, what had chased me through the woods. In the light of day, it all seemed like a bad dream, but the wounds on my body and the tatters of my clothes were vivid reminders that it had been all too real. I've ridden those trails many times since that night, but never alone and never after dark. Some say that fear is all in your head, that the only thing to be afraid of is fear itself. But I know better now. There are things that lurk in the shadows, things that defy explanation, and sometimes the difference between life and death is nothing more than a twist of fate and an old oak tree. When I finally made it home, I was a mess of cuts, bruises, and dirt. My wife took one look at me, and her eyes went wide. "What happened to you?" she gasped. I opened my mouth to explain, but where could I even begin? How could I describe the terror of being hunted through the dark woods by something that shouldn't exist? In the end, I just shook my head. "I had a bit of an accident," I said weakly. "I'm okay, just need a shower and some rest." She didn't believe me, of course. Not entirely. But she didn't press the issue, just helped me get cleaned up and into bed. As I drifted off to an exhausted sleep, I could hear her on the phone, canceling my appointments for the day in a worried voice. The next few days passed in a haze. My body ached all over, and I jumped at every unexpected sound. I told everyone I'd had a bad crash on my bike, which wasn't far from the truth. But I couldn't shake the memory of those glowing eyes in the darkness, the inhuman speed with which it had pursued me. I scoured the local news and online forums, looking for any reports of strange sightings in the area. There was nothing concrete, just the usual vague stories and blurry photos that populate any discussion of cryptids or mysterious creatures. But there were enough accounts of unexplained noises and fleeting glimpses of something large moving in the woods to make me wonder. A week after the incident, I went back to retrieve my bike. I brought 2 friends with me, making some excuse about needing help to carry it out. In reality, I was terrified of going alone. We found the bike easily enough, battered but still rideable. Of the creature, there was no sign. As we were leaving, one of my friends pointed out some strange markings on a nearby tree, deep gouges in the bark, far too high up to have been made by any normal animal. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I stared at those claw marks. "Probably just a bear," my friend said with a shrug. I nodded mutely, not trusting myself to speak. A bear, right? Never mind that bears aren't found in this part of the state, or that no bear could reach that high up the trunk. In the months since, I've tried to put that night behind me. I still ride, still love the feeling of flying down a twisting single-track trail. But something has changed. I'm more cautious now, more aware of my surroundings. And I never, ever ride alone at night. Sometimes, when I'm out on the trails and the shadows grow long, I think I catch a glimpse of something moving just out of sight. A flicker of movement, gone as soon as I turn my head. It might be my imagination, or it might be something more. Either way, I don't stick around to find out. I point my bike towards home and don't look back until I'm safely out of the woods. Because now I know the truth that most people prefer to ignore. We are not alone out there. And in the darkness of the forest, we are not at the top of the food chain. Something is out there, watching and waiting. And if you're not careful, you might just find yourself being hunted through the night, praying for the sun to rise. The scream of wind in my ears was deafening, but it couldn't drown out the panic rising in my chest. My hands clenched the handlebars in a death grip, knuckles white with fear. I was flying down the mountain at breakneck speed, and my brakes weren't working. This ride was about to become my last. It had started as a perfect day for mountain biking. The sun was shining, the air was crisp, and the trails were calling my name. I'd been looking forward to this ride all week, a chance to tackle one of the most challenging downhill runs in the area. As I drove up to the trailhead, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of nerves. This wasn't just any trail. It was known for its steep drops, tight switchbacks, and technical features that demanded respect. But I was confident in my skills and my trusty bike. We'd been through a lot together, and I knew every inch of its frame like the back of my hand. I spent a good hour climbing to the summit, the burn in my legs a welcome distraction from the butterflies in my stomach. At the top, I paused to catch my breath and take in the view. The valley stretched out below me, a patchwork of greens and browns dotted with the silver ribbons of distant rivers. It was breathtaking. "You got this," I muttered to myself, adjusting my helmet and gloves. I did a final check of my bike, making sure everything was tight and in working order. Satisfied, I clipped into my pedals and rolled towards the trailhead. The first part of the descent was exhilarating. I flowed through the initial curves with ease, my bike an extension of my body as I leaned into each turn. The trail was every bit as challenging as I'd heard, but I was holding my own. A grin spread across my face as I cleared a particularly gnarly rock garden. This was why I loved mountain biking. The perfect blend of adrenaline and skill, man and machine working in harmony. About halfway down, I approached a series of steep switchbacks. I knew from studying the trail map that this was one of the trickiest sections. I feathered my brakes, scrubbing off speed as I entered the first turn. That's when I felt it, or rather, didn't feel it. There was no resistance when I squeezed my brake levers. No slowing down. No nothing. For a split second, I couldn't process what was happening. I squeezed harder, willing the bike to slow down. Nothing. My mind raced, trying to figure out what could have gone wrong. Had a cable snapped? Had I somehow burned through my brake pads without noticing? There was no time to dwell on it. The next switchback was coming up fast, way too fast. I leaned hard into the turn, my outside pedal down, willing the tires to grip. They held barely, but I knew I couldn't keep this up. The trail was only going to get steeper and more technical from here. My speed was building with every second. Trees whipped past in a green blur. The rational part of my brain knew I needed to bail out, to lay the bike down while I still had a chance of walking away. But the thought of deliberately crashing at this speed was almost as terrifying as staying on. I spotted a slight uphill section coming up. Not much, but maybe enough to scrub off some speed. I aimed for it, using the momentary slowing to scan the trail ahead. My heart sank. There was a massive drop-off coming up, with a sharp left turn immediately after. Hit that at the speed, and I'd fly right off the mountain. Time seemed to slow down as I approached the drop. I had a choice to make, and I had to make it now. Try to ride it out and hope for a miracle, or bail and pray I didn't break every bone in my body. In that moment, a memory flashed through my mind. A technique I'd seen in a mountain biking video. Something I'd always wanted to try but never had the guts. Well, no time like the present when your life is on the line. As I hit the lip of the drop, I threw my weight back and pulled up hard on the handlebars. The front wheel lifted, and suddenly I was airborne. For a breathless moment, I was flying, the ground sickeningly far below. I spotted a small clearing just past the turn, relatively free of rocks and trees. It was my only shot. I aimed for it, using subtle movements to guide my bike through the air. The landing was going to hurt, no way around that, but if I could just keep the bike under me. The impact was like nothing I'd ever felt before. My suspension bottomed out with a sickening crunch, and I felt the shock travel up through my arms and spine. But somehow, miraculously, I was still upright. My momentum carried me into a wide skid, tires kicking up a rooster tail of dirt and leaves. When I finally slid to a stop, I just sat there trembling. My legs felt like jelly as I unclipped from my pedals and half fell, half rolled off the bike. I ripped off my helmet and gulped in deep breaths of air, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. As the adrenaline began to fade, the pain set in. My arms and legs were covered in scrapes and bruises, and my back felt like one giant knot. But I was alive. Somehow, against all odds, I was alive. I don't know how long I lay there, just breathing and thanking whatever higher power might be listening. Eventually, I managed to sit up and take stock of my situation. My bike was in rough shape. The frame was intact, but both wheels were badly bent, and the fork looked suspect. It wasn't rideable, that was for sure. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone. No signal, of course. I was going to have to hike out of here. The thought of trying to navigate the rest of this trail on foot was daunting, but I didn't have much choice. As I gathered myself to stand, movement caught my eye. A small group of riders had come around the corner, stopping short when they saw me and the wreckage of my bike. "Holy shit, dude," one of them called out. "Are you okay? We saw your skid marks and thought." He trailed off, but I knew what he was thinking. They'd expected to find a body. "I'm all right," I called back, my voice shakier than I'd like. Brakes failed. Had to put her down. They helped me to my feet, exclaiming over my story and the state of my bike. One of them had a satellite phone and called for help while the others shared their water and first aid supplies. I was battered and bruised, but nothing seemed to be broken. As we waited for rescue, I couldn't stop replaying those terrifying moments in my mind. How close had I come to death? A foot to either side on that landing, and I'd be nothing but a statistic, another tale of caution for fellow riders. The park rangers arrived about an hour later with a UTV to transport me out. As they loaded me up, one of them shook his head in disbelief. "I've been working these trails for 15 years, he said, "and I've never seen anyone walk away from something like this. You must have a guardian angel looking out for you." Maybe he was right, or maybe it was just dumb luck. Either way, I knew one thing for certain. I'd been given a second chance, and I wasn't going to waste it. The aftermath of the accident was a blur of hospital visits, insurance claims, and explaining over and over to concerned friends and family just how close I'd come to disaster. My bike was a total loss, but I couldn't bring myself to care. Every time I looked at the mangled wreckage, all I could think about was how easily it could have been me broken beyond repair. For weeks, I had nightmares about the crash. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the sensation of falling still vivid in my mind. The thought of getting back on a bike filled me with dread. Had this been the universe's way of telling me to find a safer hobby? But as my body healed, so did my spirit. I found myself missing the trails, the sense of freedom and accomplishment that came with conquering a difficult run. The accident had shaken me, no doubt, but it had also shown me what I was capable of when pushed to the absolute limit. 3 months after the crash, I bought a new bike, top of the line, with the best brakes money could buy. I checked and double-checked every component before each ride, a habit born of hard-won experience. My first time back on a real trail was nerve-wracking. Every downhill section had my heart racing, phantom sensations of out-of-control speed making my palms sweat. But with each ride, it got a little easier. I found my flow again, remembered why I fell in love with the sport in the first place. I never tackled that particular trail again. Some memories are best left in the past. But I didn't let fear keep me off the mountains. If anything, I rode with more passion than ever before, acutely aware of the precious gift each ride represented. These days, when I reach the top of a climb and look out over the valley below, I take a moment to appreciate more than just a view. I think about how close I came to never seeing it again, and how fortunate I am to still be here, still riding, still living. And then I point my front wheel downhill, feel the familiar rush of excitement and drop in, because life, like mountain biking, is all about the journey, the ups and downs, the challenges and triumphs. Sometimes you crash, but you get back up. You fix what's broken, learn from your mistakes, and keep moving forward. After all, the trail goes on, and there's always another ride waiting. The first time I saw him, I thought it was just a coincidence. The 100th time, I knew it was anything but. Every day, same route, same time, same piercing eyes following my every move. I never should have smiled back. My name is Sarah, and for the past 3 months, my daily bike commute has turned into a waking nightmare. It all started on a crisp autumn morning. I'd recently moved to the city for a new job and decided that biking to work would be a great way to stay in shape and avoid the crowded subway. The route I chose was a pleasant mix of quiet side streets and a stretch along the river, perfect for clearing my head before a long day at the office. About a week into my new routine, I noticed him for the first time. He was tall, probably in his mid-30s, with dark hair and an athletic build. Nothing particularly remarkable, just another cyclist out for a morning ride. We passed each other going opposite directions, and I gave him a polite nod. He smiled back, a bit too widely for my comfort, but I brushed it off. The next day, there he was again. Same spot, same time. This time, his eyes lingered a bit longer as we passed. A small voice in the back of my head whispered that something wasn't quite right, but I silenced it. After all, plenty of people have regular cycling routines. It was probably nothing, but as the days turned into weeks, I couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. Every single morning, without fail, he was there, always wearing different clothes, always on a different bike, but unmistakably the same man. And his behavior was becoming increasingly unsettling. He started timing his rides to match my pace, following at a distance just close enough to make me uncomfortable, but not so close that I could confront him without seeming paranoid. Sometimes he'd surge ahead, only to slow down and let me pass, his eyes burning into my back as I rode by. I tried changing up my route, leaving at different times, but somehow he always found me. It was as if he had a sixth sense for my location. The constant feeling of being watched was taking its toll. I found myself looking over my shoulder constantly, jumping at every sound. My coworkers noticed my increasing anxiety, but how could I explain? Oh, it's nothing, just a mysterious cyclist who seems to be stalking me. I'd sound crazy. One morning, about 2 months into this ordeal, I decided I'd had enough. I stopped abruptly in the middle of the path, causing him to nearly crash into me. I whirled around, ready to confront him, to demand an explanation for his behavior, but the words died in my throat as I met his gaze. There was something in his eyes, a mixture of intensity and emptiness that chilled me to my core. He smiled that too wide smile again, and before I could gather my wits, he spoke. Good morning, Sarah. Beautiful day for a ride, isn't it? My blood ran cold. I had never told him my name. I mumbled something incoherent and pedaled away as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my ears. How did he know my name? What else did he know about me? The questions swirled in my mind, each more terrifying than the last. That night, I barely slept. I considered calling in sick to work, but the thought of being alone in my apartment all day was even more frightening. So the next morning, I got on my bike with shaking hands and set out, constantly scanning my surroundings. He wasn't there. For the first time in months, I completed my ride without seeing him. I should have felt relieved, but instead, a new kind of dread settled over me. Where was he? What was he planning? The next day was the same, no sign of him. And the next and the next. A week passed, and I began to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the stress of the new job and the move had gotten to me more than I realized. I started to relax, to enjoy my rides again. That's when I saw the note. It was tucked under my bike seat, a small white envelope with my name written in an elegant script. With trembling fingers, I opened it. Inside was a single sentence. I miss our morning ride, Sarah. I dropped the note as if it had burned me. He knew where I lived. He had been to my apartment, had touched my bike. The violation of my personal space sent waves of nausea through me. I called in sick that day, then spent hours pacing my apartment, jumping at every sound. I considered going to the police, but what would I tell them? I had no proof, no evidence beyond a vague description and a note that, while creepy, wasn't explicitly threatening. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't live like this anymore. I needed to take control of the situation, to confront my fears head on. I would take a different route to work tomorrow, one I had never used before. If he showed up there, I would know for certain that this was no coincidence, and I would confront him, consequences be damned. I spent hours planning my new route, choosing streets I had never cycled on before. It was longer and less scenic, but it felt like my only option. As I finally drifted off to sleep, I prayed that tomorrow would bring an end to this nightmare one way or another. The next morning dawned gray and misty, fitting my mood perfectly. I set out earlier than usual, the streets still quiet and empty. Every passing car made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. But as I neared the halfway point of my journey, I began to relax. There was no sign of him. I turned down an unfamiliar street, lined with old warehouses and abandoned storefronts. It wasn't the prettiest part of town, but it was deserted, which suited me just fine. I was so focused on scanning the road ahead that I almost missed the sound of another bike approaching from behind. My heart leapt into my throat as I glanced back. There he was, closing the distance between us rapidly. How had he known? How had he found me here, of all places? Panic gave me speed as I pedaled harder, desperate to put some distance between us. But he was faster, stronger. I could hear him getting closer, the sound of his tires on the pavement mixing with my ragged breathing. Just as I felt his presence right behind me, I spotted an alley up ahead. Without thinking, I swerved into it, hoping to lose him in the maze of back streets. But my relief turned to horror as I realized my mistake. The alley was a dead end. I skidded to a stop, my back while fishtailing on the slick pavement. Slowly, I turned to face my pursuer, my whole body trembling with fear and exhaustion. He stood there, straddling his bike, that eerie smile still plastered on his face. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was our heavy breathing and the distant rumble of the waking city. Why? I finally managed to choke out. Why are you doing this? His smile faltered for a moment, confusion flickering across his features. Doing what, Sarah? I'm just out for my morning ride. Same as you. The casual tone of his voice, as if this was all perfectly normal, sent a chill down my spine. How do you know my name? Why have you been following me for months? He tilted his head, looking genuinely perplexed. Following you? Oh no, you've got it all wrong. I haven't been following you, Sarah. We're connected, you and I. Can't you feel it? Every morning, no matter where you go, I'm drawn to you. It's fate." As he spoke, he began to move towards me, still straddling his bike. I pressed my back against the wall, wishing I could meld into it. "Stay back," I warned, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll scream. I'll call the police." He paused, frowning slightly. "There's no need for that. I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to talk, to explain. We're meant to be together, Sarah. I've known it since the first time I saw you." His words sent a wave of revulsion through me. This man was clearly delusional, dangerous. I needed to get out of here, now. As if in answer to my silent prayer, I heard voices approaching from the street. Early morning workers, heading to their jobs. My stalker heard them too, his head snapping towards the sound. In that moment of distraction, I made my move. I pushed off from the wall with all my might, aiming my bike straight at him. He was so surprised that he didn't have time to react. I clipped his front wheel as I sped past, sending him sprawling. I didn't look back as I flew out of the alley, my legs pumping furiously. I rode like I never had before, running red lights and weaving through traffic, not stopping until I reached the police station. As I gasped out my story to the bewildered desk sergeant, I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. I knew this wasn't over. He was still out there, still fixated on me. But I wasn't helpless anymore. I would fight back, protect myself. From that day on, I never rode alone again. I varied my routes, installed security cameras at my apartment, took self-defense classes. Slowly, I reclaimed my life, my sense of safety. But even now, years later, I still catch myself scanning every cyclist I pass, my heart skipping a beat when I see a tall, dark-haired man on a bike. Because I know the truth that most people prefer to ignore. Sometimes, a smile from a stranger isn't just a smile. Sometimes, it's the beginning of a nightmare. The forest had swallowed us whole, and as night fell, we realized we weren't alone. The cabin loomed before us. A beacon of hope turned ominous as engines rumbled in the distance. We had stumbled into something we never should have seen, and now there was nowhere left to run. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway, just 4 friends exploring new trails on our mountain bikes. Jake, our self-appointed leader, had heard about this epic route from a guy at work. "It's a local secret," he'd said, eyes gleaming with excitement. "Absolutely insane downhills, and hardly anyone knows about it." That should have been our first warning sign. Sarah, Tom, and I exchanged skeptical glances, but Jake's enthusiasm was infectious. Before we knew it, we were packing our gear and heading out to the middle of nowhere, armed with nothing but our bikes, some trail mix, and Jake's less than reliable sense of direction. The first few hours were incredible. The trail was everything Jake had promised. Challenging climbs rewarded by exhilarating descents through pristine forest. We whooped and hollered as we caught air off natural jumps, the adrenaline masking our growing fatigue. It wasn't until late afternoon that we realized something was wrong. The trail had become increasingly faint, often disappearing entirely. We found ourselves pushing our bikes through dense underbrush more often than riding them. "Jake, are you sure this is the right way?" Sarah asked, swatting at mosquitoes. "Of course," Jake replied, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "The guy said it gets a bit overgrown towards the end, but it'll open up soon. Trust me." 2 hours later, with the sun dipping dangerously low on the horizon, we had to face facts. We were lost. "Great job, Jake," Tom muttered, kicking at a fallen branch in frustration. "Now what?" I pulled out my phone, already knowing it was useless. No signal, of course. We were miles from the nearest cell tower. "Okay, let's not panic," I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. "We've got some food and water left. We can hunker down for the night and try to find our way back in the morning." Sarah nodded, always the practical one. "We need to find some kind of shelter. It's going to get cold once the sun sets." As if on cue, a chilly breeze rustled through the trees. Carrying with it the faint scent of smoke, we all froze, sniffing the air. "You smell that?" Jake asked, perking up. "Where there's smoke, there's people. Come on." Before we could stop him, he was off, pushing his bike through the undergrowth towards the source of the smell. With no better options, we followed. 20 minutes of stumbling through the darkening forest brought us to a small clearing. And there, like something out of a fairy tale, stood a cabin. It wasn't much to look at. Weathered logs, a sagging roof, windows dark and grimy. But to us, it was a godsend. "Hello," Jake called out, approaching the front door. "Anyone home? We're lost and could use some help." Silence. "Maybe it's abandoned," Sarah suggested, peering through a dirty window. "Looks like no one's been here in a while." I wasn't so sure. The smoke we'd smelled was fresh, and as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I could make out recent tire tracks in the dirt around the cabin. "I don't know, guys," I said, a growing sense of unease settling in my stomach. "Maybe we should keep moving, try to find the trail again." Tom shook his head. "It's almost dark, and we have no idea where we are. At least this place has walls and a roof. We can figure things out in the morning." I wanted to argue, but exhaustion won out. We leaned our bikes against the side of the cabin and cautiously approached the door. It wasn't locked. The hinges creaked ominously as Jake pushed it open, revealing a Spartan interior lit by the last rays of sunlight filtering through the windows. A rough wooden table, a couple of chairs, a small pot-bellied stove in the corner, and on every available surface, piles and piles of cash. "Holy shit," Tom whispered, his eyes wide as saucers. Stacks of bills, some neatly bundled, others scattered haphazardly across the table and floor. More money than I'd ever seen in my life. "We need to leave," Sarah said urgently, backing towards the door. "Now, this isn't right." But before we could move, a sound froze us in our tracks. The distant but unmistakable rumble of engines, growing louder by the second. "Quick, kill the lights," I hissed, even though we hadn't turned any on. We scrambled to close the door and ducked below the windows, hearts pounding. The engines grew louder, then cut off abruptly. Car doors slammed, voices low and angry, carried through the still night air. "I'm telling you, it wasn't me," a man's voice, high-pitched with fear. "I didn't take anything, I swear." "Save it," another voice growled. "Boss wants to talk to you himself. Let's go." Footsteps crunched on gravel, approaching the cabin. I could feel Sarah trembling beside me, saw the panic in Jake's eyes. We were trapped. The door burst open, and a large figure filled the doorway, silhouetted against the headlights outside. I held my breath, certain we were about to be discovered, but the man didn't enter. He just stood there for a long moment, then turned back to his companions. "All clear," he called out. "Stash is still here." "Good," came the reply. "Load it up. We're moving out tonight." For the next agonizing hour, we huddled in the shadows, barely daring to breathe as the men outside transferred the money from the cabin to their vehicles. Through gaps in the floorboards, we caught glimpses of boots, heard snatches of conversation. None of it good. "What about Ricky? Boss'll deal with him." "Shame, really. He was a good driver." "Yeah, well, that's what happens when you get greedy in this business." Finally, mercifully, the last of the cash was loaded. Engines roared to life, and the sound of vehicles pulling away faded into the distance. We waited another 10 minutes before anyone dared to move or speak. What the hell was that?" Jake whispered, his face pale in the moonlight, now streaming through the windows. "Drug money, probably," Tom replied, his voice shaky. "Or worse. We need to get out of here, now." No one argued. We grabbed our bikes and set off into the night, using the moon and stars to navigate roughly back the way we'd come. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush sent spikes of fear through me. I kept expecting to hear engines again, to see headlights cutting through the trees. We rode through the night, exhaustion and terror propelling us forward. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, we finally stumbled onto a real trail. From there, it was another 2 hours of tense riding before we reached the trailhead where we'd parked our car. The drive home was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. What had we witnessed? Should we go to the police? Would anyone even believe us? In the end, we decided to keep quiet. We had no proof, and the thought of those men somehow tracking us down was too terrifying to contemplate. We made a pact to never speak of that night again to anyone. But even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of that cabin in the woods. Sometimes, when I'm out on a ride and the trail takes an unfamiliar turn, I feel a chill run down my spine. I find myself scanning the trees, half expecting to see a weathered log structure emerge from the shadows. Because now I know the truth that most people prefer to ignore. The wilderness isn't always empty. Sometimes, in the deepest parts of the forest, where the trails fade away and the shadows grow long, you might stumble upon secrets that were never meant to be found. And if you're not careful, those secrets might just follow you home. Jake never suggested any secret trails after that. Our rides became tamer, sticking to well-known routes and popular bike parks. But I could see it in his eyes, in all of our eyes really. That constant wariness, the knowledge that around any bend, behind any tree, danger could be lurking. We drifted apart eventually, as friends often do. But every now and then, I'll get a text from Sarah or a call from Tom, usually late at night. We never talk about it directly, but I know they're thinking about it too. About the cabin, the money, the voices in the dark. I still ride. The love of mountain biking is too deeply ingrained in me to give it up. But I ride differently now. More cautiously, more aware. I always tell someone where I'm going and when I'll be back. I carry a satellite phone, just in case. And I never, ever venture off the marked trails, because the forest keeps its secrets, and sometimes it's better not to know what's hiding in the shadows. The thrill of discovery isn't worth the price you might have to pay. So I stick to the known paths, content with the adventures they provide, always keeping one eye on the trail and one on the deepening woods beyond. After all, you never know what you might find out there, or what might find you. The darkness swallowed me whole, my world shrinking to the sound of my own ragged breathing and the frantic beat of my heart. In the pitch-black tunnel, every echo became a threat, every draft a ghostly touch. I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making, with no way out but through. It started as just another mundane Tuesday. I'd been commuting by bike for months, enjoying the exercise and the chance to avoid the crowded subway. My route took me through a long tunnel that cut under a hill, not the most scenic part of the ride, but it shaved a good 10 minutes off my journey. I'd done this route so many times, I could probably navigate it blindfolded. The tunnel was always lit, albeit dimly, and I'd pass maybe one or two other cyclists on a busy day. It wasn't exactly pleasant, but it was familiar, safe, or so I thought. That morning, I was running late. I'd hit snooze one too many times, skipped breakfast, and was now pedaling furiously to make up time. As I approached the tunnel entrance, I barely registered that it seemed darker than usual. My mind was too focused on the meeting I was probably going to be late for. The presentation I hadn't quite finished. It wasn't until I was about a quarter of the way through that I realized something was wrong. The usual dim lights were out completely, leaving me in near total darkness. My bike light, meant more for being seen than for seeing, cast a feeble beam that barely illuminated a few feet in front of me. I slowed down, suddenly uncertain. Should I turn back? But I was already a good distance in, and the thought of being late to work pushed me forward. It's fine, I told myself. Probably just a power outage. The tunnel's straight, no traffic. You'll be through in no time. Halfway through, disaster struck. My light flickered once, twice, then died completely. I squeezed the brakes, coming to a stop in the oppressive darkness. Panic rose in my throat as I fumbled with the light, praying for it to come back on. Nothing. The batteries were dead. For a moment, I just stood there, straddling my bike, trying to calm my racing heart. Okay, don't freak out. You've got your phone, right? But as I reached for my pocket, I remembered with sickening clarity. I'd left it charging on my nightstand in my rush to leave. The silence pressed in around me, broken only by the sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance. I closed my eyes, then opened them again, seeing no difference. The darkness was absolute. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing eerily off the tunnel walls. "Is anyone there? I could use some help." No response. Of course not. Who else would be stupid enough to ride into a pitch-black tunnel? I took a deep breath, trying to think rationally. The tunnel wasn't that long. If I just kept going straight, I'd reach the exit eventually. I could walk the bike, using the wall as a guide. Keeping one hand on the cold, damp wall, I started to push my bike forward. The wheels squeaked slightly, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Every step was an act of faith. The rational part of my brain knew the path was clear, but primal fears whispered of unseen obstacles, of pits opening up beneath my feet. I'm not sure how long I walked like that. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the darkness. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. My imagination ran wild, conjuring up every scary story I'd ever heard about dark tunnels and things that lurk in the shadows. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Footsteps, echoing from somewhere ahead of me. Relief flooded through me. Another person, someone with a light maybe, who could help me out of this nightmare. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking slightly. "Over here. I could use some help." The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, quietly at first but growing louder, I heard whispers. Not one voice, but many, overlapping in a sinister chorus that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I froze, suddenly unsure if I wanted to encounter whoever, or whatever, was ahead of me. The whispers grew louder, seeming to come from all around now. I couldn't make out words, just a malevolent hissing that set my teeth on edge. Panic took over. I turned and ran, abandoning my bike, no longer caring about keeping a hand on the wall. I ran blindly through the darkness, arms outstretched, terrified of crashing into something, but more afraid of what might be behind me. The whispers pursued me, growing louder, more frenzied. I could swear I felt cold breath on the back of my neck, ghostly fingers grasping at my clothes. My lungs burned. My legs ached, but terror kept me moving. Just when I thought I couldn't run another step, my outstretched hands hit something solid. A wall. I'd reached the end of the tunnel. Frantically, I felt around, searching for the exit. Where was it? It had to be here somewhere. My fingers found an edge, then open air. Without hesitation, I threw myself through the opening, tumbling onto hard ground. Daylight assaulted my eyes, painfully bright after the absolute darkness of the tunnel. I lay there gasping, momentarily blinded, expecting at any second to feel cold hands grabbing me, dragging me back into the darkness. But there was nothing, just the sounds of distant traffic and birdsong. As my eyes adjusted and my breathing slowed, I took in my surroundings. I was at the tunnel exit, exactly where I should be. My clothes were dirty and torn from my blind flight, and I had some scrapes and bruises from my fall. But I was out. I was safe. I looked back at the tunnel entrance. It was dark, yes, but not the impenetrable blackness I'd experienced inside. I could see a good way in, could even make out my abandoned bike lying on its side about 50 feet back. What the hell had happened in there? On shaking legs, I stood up and retrieved my bike. My watch told me that only 20 minutes had passed since I entered the tunnel. It felt like hours. I walked my bike the rest of the way to work, jumping at every shadow, flinching at every unexpected sound. I was over an hour late to my meeting. I mumbled some excuse about a flat tire, unable to even begin explaining what had really happened. Who would believe me? I barely believed it myself. That evening, I took a taxi home, unable to face the tunnel again. I told myself I was just tired, that I'd bike again tomorrow. But as I lay in bed that night, I knew I was lying to myself. The memory of that darkness, of those whispers, was etched into my brain. I'd never be able to enter that tunnel again. The next day, I mapped out a new route to work. It was longer, hillier, and put me in traffic more, but it avoided the tunnel. I told my co-workers I was looking for a better workout. They seemed to buy it, but I caught them exchanging glances when they thought I wasn't looking. I knew I wasn't the same person I'd been before that day in the tunnel. Weeks passed. I started seeing a therapist, trying to process what had happened. Was it all in my head? Some kind of panic attack brought on by the darkness? Or had there really been something in there with me? Something that defied rational explanation? I never got a satisfactory answer. The tunnel was investigated after I anonymously reported the light outage, but nothing unusual was found. Just a burned-out fuse, they said. Must have been a coincidence. But I know what I experienced. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear those whispers, feel the oppressive weight of that darkness pressing in on me. I've become a bit of a joke among my friends. The guy who's afraid of the dark, who always carries 3 different lights and extra batteries on every ride. Let them laugh. They haven't seen what I've seen, haven't felt what I've felt. They don't understand that sometimes the darkness isn't just the absence of light. Sometimes it's alive, waiting, hungry. I still ride my bike. I still love the freedom of it, the rush of wind in my face and burning in my legs as I crest a hill. But I stick to open roads now, to bright, sunlit paths where shadows can't linger. Because I know the truth that most people prefer to ignore. Not all tunnels lead where you expect them to. Some are portals to places we were never meant to go, where the laws of reality bend and break. And once you've glimpsed what lies beyond, you can never unsee it. So I ride in the light, always in the light, and I warn others when I can, because the darkness is patient, and it's always waiting for another unsuspecting soul to wander into its embrace.